The air in the gear locker hung thick and heavy, smelling of salt, neoprene, and nervous sweat. It was the smell of ambition and fear, a scent Ana Reyes had come to know intimately over a decade of service, though never from this side of the fence. Here, among the candidates for the Navy's new Advanced Maritime Operations course, she was just another number, another body to be broken down and, if she was lucky, rebuilt. Commander Volkov moved down the line of assembled candidates, his presence sucking the air from the room. He was a man carved from granite and arrogance, a legend in the SEAL teams whose reputation preceded him like a shockwave. His eyes, pale and cold as a winter sea, scanned each candidate, lingering on any perceived flaw. He stopped in front of Reyes. She stood at a relaxed parade rest, her gaze fixed on the gray bulkhead behind him, her posture economical and still. She was of average height, with a wiry strength that didn't advertise itself. Her face was plain, unremarkable, framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe, regulation bun. To the casual observer, she was forgettable. Volkov was a casual observer. He tapped her dive compass with a thick finger. This isn't calibrated for magnetic north declination in this AO. You planning on navigating to Mexico? Candidate. His voice was a low growl, meant to intimidate. The deviation is negligible for the initial coastal phase, Commander, Reyes replied, her tone level, devoid of challenge or submission. I plan to adjust it prior to the open water evolution. Volkov's lips curled into a smirk. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only those nearby could hear. You planned. You think a lot, don't you? Thinking doesn't get you through this course. Doing does. He moved on without waiting for a response. A few spots down the line, a broad-shouldered candidate named Decker snickered. Hey Jensen, he whispered to the man next to him. Better check your compass. Don't want the professor to leave you behind. Reyes didn't react. Her breathing remained slow and even, a steady 2-second inhale, 3-second exhale. She had catalogued Volkov's inspection method in the first 5 minutes. He checked for the obvious. Loose straps, dirty gear, anything out of regulation. He wasn't checking for function, for the subtle signs of wear that predicted failure under stress. He was checking for compliance. It was a test of obedience, not readiness. She'd already noted the slight fraying on Decker's primary regulator hose, the saltwater corrosion on the battery contact of Jensen's dive light. Small things. The kind of things that got people killed. The only other instructor in the room, Master Chief Petty Officer Thorne, watched from the corner. Thorne was the opposite of Volkov. Where the commander was loud, Thorne was silent. His face was a roadmap of sun wrinkles and old scars, and his eyes missed nothing. He saw Reyes's calm, the way she didn't flinch or bristle at the commander's condescension. He saw the methodical, almost surgical way her gear was laid out, everything positioned for efficiency, not just for inspection. He saw her glance at Decker's regulator hose, a flicker of assessment in her eyes, before she returned her gaze to the bulkhead. Thorne filed it away. The first week was a relentless physical crucible designed to separate the weak from the merely exhausted. They ran for miles in the soft, unforgiving sand of Coronado Beach, the Pacific churning beside them. They did push-ups until their arms trembled and their chests were raw. They spent hours in the cold ocean, their bodies shivering uncontrollably, learning to find a place of mental stillness inside the pain. It was called surf torture, and it was aptly named. During one evolution, as the candidates lay in the wash of the cold waves, their arms linked, Decker started to sing a mocking cadence. Saw a little girl on the sandy ground, he chanted, his voice raw. The other candidates, desperate for any distraction, picked it up. Cried so hard she almost drowned. Reyes lay beside him, her face a mask of placid endurance. She focused on the pressure of the water, the pull of the undertow, the rhythm of her own breathing. The cold was a fact, not a threat. The pain was a signal, not a judgment. The childish taunts were just noise, irrelevant data in a complex equation of survival. Volkov stood on the dry sand, arms crossed, a cruel smile on his face. He let the chant continue. "This is how you build a team," he shouted over the roar of the surf. "You find the weak link and you hammer it until it breaks or gets stronger. No room for feelings here." Reyes felt a subtle shift in the man to her left, a young ensign named Corrigan. His shivering had become more violent, his breathing ragged and shallow. Hypothermia was setting in. She pressed her side against his, a small, almost imperceptible transfer of warmth. "Breathe with me, Corrigan," she said, her voice a low murmur, easily lost in the surf but pitched directly for his ear. "In for 2, out for 3. Match me." Corrigan's frantic gaze found hers. He nodded, a barely perceptible jerk of his head. He tried to match her rhythm, his gasps slowly evening out into shuddering breaths. Reyes didn't look at him again. She kept her eyes on the horizon, where the gray sky met the gray water, a seamless expanse of indifference. Master Chief Thorn, waiting in the surf nearby, saw the exchange. He saw Corrigan's breathing stabilize. He saw Reyes, seemingly unaffected, acting as a human anchor in the line. He looked at Volkov, who was still pontificating from the beach, and a deep line formed between his brows. The days bled into one another, a montage of exhaustion and exertion. The classroom sessions were a blur of charts, tables, and tactical theory. Volkov taught them, pacing before the screen like a caged predator. His lessons were anecdotes of his own heroism, thin veneers for lessons on demolition, hydrography, and infiltration. He rewarded aggressive, confident answers even when they were wrong. He ridiculed hesitation and careful consideration. "The enemy isn't going to wait for you to run the numbers, candidate," he barked at Jensen one afternoon, after the young officer took a moment too long to calculate a demolition charge. "Hesitate and you're dead. Your whole team is dead." Reyes sat in the back, her notebook filled with precise, clean script. She didn't just write down what Volkov said. She cross-referenced it with the official naval special warfare manuals she had memorized years ago. She noted the discrepancies, the corners Volkov cut, the outdated procedures he taught as gospel because they were his procedures. She noted the way he fostered a climate of competition over collaboration, of speed over certainty. Fear of looking weak was the prime motivator. It was a culture that created brittle soldiers, men who would charge forward bravely into a minefield because they were too afraid to stop and check the map. During a practical exercise on the obstacle course, the pressure Volkov was building found its first release valve. The task was to scale the 30-foot vertical cargo net, traverse a rope, and rappel down the other side, all while carrying a 40-pound pack. The course was slick from a morning mist. Decker, eager to impress, scrambled up the net with reckless speed. He muscled his way over the top, forgoing a proper three-point contact technique for sheer momentum. As he transitioned to the rope traverse, his boot slipped on a wet strand. He flailed, his grip failing. For a heart-stopping second, he dangled by one hand before crashing down into the safety net below. He landed awkwardly, his ankle twisting with a sickening pop. He roared in frustration and pain. Volkov stormed over, his face thunderous. "Get up," he yelled. "Pain is a choice. Get off my course." Decker tried to stand, his face pale, but collapsed back with a sharp cry. It was obvious his ankle was broken. Reyes, who had just finished the obstacle with fluid, unhurried precision, was already at the edge of the pit. "Master Chief," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through Volkov's tirade. "We need a medic. Potential compound fracture of the tibia." Thorn was already moving, keying his radio. Volkov turned on her, his eyes blazing. "Who the hell made you the doctor, candidate? And who gave you permission to speak?" "I'm stating an observation, Commander," Reyes said, her gaze steady. "The candidate is injured. Continuing to berate him is counterproductive to his health and the morale of the class." The other candidates froze. No one spoke to Commander Volkov like that. It was career suicide. The air crackled with tension. Volkov took a step toward her, his jaw clenching. He looked like he was about to explode. But Thorn's voice cut in, calm and authoritative. "Commander, she's right. Let's get him to the medics. We can debrief the performance later." Volkov's glare shifted from Reyes to Thorn. A silent battle of wills fought in a fraction of a second. The commander, for all his bluster, knew he couldn't override his senior enlisted advisor on a safety issue in front of the entire class. It would be a catastrophic failure of leadership. He spun on his heel, barking orders to the other candidates to clear the area. The rest of you worthless sacks, back to the grinder. I want 1,000 flutter kicks. Now! As the medic stabilized Decker's ankle and carried him away, Thorn caught Reyes's eye. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. A silent message passed between them. I see you. Reyes simply met his gaze for a moment before turning and joining the rest of the class in the sand. Her face as impassive as ever. The incident was logged, filed away in her mind. Another data point. Another crack in the foundation of the command. The pressure was building. She knew, with the cold certainty of a meteorologist predicting a hurricane, that the system was heading for a catastrophic failure. It was only a matter of when. The final phase of selection was a 48-hour continuous field training exercise, codenamed Iron Tide. It was the culmination of everything they had learned. A long-distance underwater transit, a simulated reconnaissance of a hostile port, planting a dummy limpet mine on a target vessel, and exfiltrating back to a submerged extraction point. It was designed to push them to the absolute limit of their physical and mental endurance. The weather forecast was marginal. A storm system was moving down the coast, promising high winds and punishing seas. Any reasonable commander would have postponed the exercise. Commander Volkov saw it as an opportunity. Real-world ops don't wait for sunny skies, he announced in the pre-mission brief, his voice booming in the cavernous concrete room. The candidates, gaunt and hollow-eyed from weeks of attrition, sat hunched over their charts. This is what separates us from everyone else. We go out when others stay home. This storm will be your final instructor. It will teach you humility. Reyes sat at the back of the room, meticulously plotting the course on her hydrographic chart. Her pencil moved with a surgeon's precision. She cross-referenced the tidal charts with the storm surge predictions, her brow furrowed in concentration. The numbers weren't adding up. The forecast called for a 5-foot swell, but the bathymetry of the channel they were transiting would amplify it. The current, already strong, would become a violent, unpredictable torrent when the storm hit its peak, right when they were scheduled to be at their most vulnerable on the final approach to the target. She raised her hand. Volkov ignored it. She kept it raised, a silent, stubborn pillar in the back of the room. What is it, Reyes? He finally snapped, his patience worn thin. Commander, my analysis of the tide and storm data suggests the current in the main channel will exceed 7 knots at 0200. That's outside the operational parameters of our DPDs. We won't be able to make headway. The diver propulsion devices were their underwater scooters, essential for covering the long distance. Volkov laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Your analysis? You're a candidate, not a goddamn oceanographer. My plan accounts for the current. Your job is to shut your mouth and swim where you're told. Are we clear? Yes, Commander, she replied, her voice flat. She lowered her hand and made a new notation on her chart, a small circled X with a time next to it. It was the point where she predicted her team would reach critical failure if they followed Volkov's plan. Master Chief Thorn stood by the door, his arms crossed. He had seen her calculations. He had run his own numbers and they mirrored hers. He had voiced his concerns to Volkov in private an hour earlier and had been summarily dismissed. They need to be pushed, Master Chief, Volkov had said. Iron sharpens iron. Thorn knew that iron also breaks if you hammer it too hard. He watched Reyes make her notation and felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The insertion was at dusk. They slipped from the back of a speeding Zodiac into the cold, black water, the shock of it stealing their breath. The world narrowed to the green glow of their compass boards and the muffled hiss of their rebreathers. They were 3 teams of 4, moving like phantoms beneath the waves. Reyes was on Alpha Team with Jensen, Corrigan, and another candidate named Wallace. For the first few hours, things went according to plan. The sea was choppy but manageable. They maintained their formation, a diamond of shadows gliding through the darkness. Reyes kept a constant mental clock, tracking their speed, depth, and air consumption. She was a machine of quiet efficiency. Then the storm hit, came on not gradually, but like a switch being thrown. The surface, 20 feet above them, turned into a chaotic maelstrom. The gentle swell became a violent, bone-jarring surge that tossed them around like rag dolls. The force of the water was immense, a physical blow that hammered them from every direction. Visibility dropped to near zero in the churned-up sand and silt. Their DPDs, powerful as they were, whined in protest as they fought against the mounting current. Just as Reyes had predicted, the funneling effect of the channel had turned the water into a river. They were burning through battery power at an alarming rate, yet they were barely making progress. Static crackled in their earpieces. It was Volkov, his voice tinny and distorted from the command boat on the surface. "All teams, report. Alpha, what's your status?" Jensen, the team leader, keyed his mic. "Alpha is fighting a heavy current. Commander. Progress is slow. Negative, Alpha leader." Volkov's voice crackled back, laced with irritation. "Your progress is not slow, it is unacceptable. Pick up the pace. Do not fail this mission." Jensen tried to push his DPD harder, but the motor was already at maximum. They were losing ground. Worse, the violent motion was disorienting. Vertigo began to set in. Reyes saw Corrigan's light waver, his movements becoming erratic. He was panicking. Suddenly, Wallace's DPD sputtered and died, its battery exhausted. He was now dead in the water, a liability. The current immediately seized him, threatening to tear him away from the team. Jensen grabbed his harness, fighting to hold on, but it threw their own navigation into chaos. They were being swept off course, deeper into the channel and away from their objective. "Commander, this is Alpha," Jensen yelled into his mic, his voice tight with strain. "We have a disabled DPD. We are off course. Requesting permission to abort." The reply was a burst of static. Then silence. On the surface, the command boat was in its own hell. A rogue wave, larger than the others, had smashed over the vessel, frying the main communications console and swamping the deck. Volkov was bellowing orders that went nowhere, his authority useless against the fury of the ocean. The safety boat assigned to Shadow Bravo team had been swamped minutes earlier, its crew now fighting for their own survival. They were blind, deaf, and rapidly losing control. Beneath the waves, Alpha Team was on the verge of disintegration. Corrigan, fully succumbing to panic and disorientation, vomited into his rebreather's mouthpiece. It was a death sentence. The caustic mixture of stomach acid and salt water would flood his breathing loop, choking him. Reyes acted without hesitation. There was no time for permission, no room for debate. Her movements were swift, economical, and precise. She shoved her DPD into Jensen's hands, signaling him to hold it and Wallace steady. She then launched herself toward Corrigan, a blur of motion in the murky water. She grabbed him from behind, pinning his arms. With one hand, she ripped his regulator from his mouth, preventing him from taking another fatal breath. With the other, she reached for her own emergency bailout bottle, a small secondary air supply. She forced the regulator into his mouth and purged it, the blast of clean air clearing the foul mixture. Corrigan coughed and gagged, but he was breathing. He was still panicking, his eyes wide with terror behind his mask. Reyes got in front of him, her face inches from his. She didn't signal or shout. She simply held his gaze. Her own eyes were preternaturally calm. She tapped 2 fingers on her chest, then pointed at him. "Me, you." Then she started to breathe, a slow, deliberate rhythm, making sure he could see the slight expansion and contraction of her chest. "Breathe with me." The primal, instinctual part of Corrigan's brain, the part that had been screaming in terror, latched onto her stillness. Her calm was an anchor in the chaos. His frantic movements began to slow. His breathing, ragged and sharp, started to even out, matching hers. The immediate crisis was over, but they were still in mortal danger. They were being swept out to sea, leaderless and without power. Jensen was looking at her, his expression a mixture of fear and dawning respect. He was the designated leader, but he was lost. Reyes took control. It wasn't a spoken command. It was an assumption of responsibility so total and instantaneous that no one questioned it. She pointed at Wallace, then at Jensen's DPD, signaling for Wallace to hold on. She pointed at Corrigan, then at herself. She would buddy-breathe with him off her main supply, saving the bailout bottle. Then she made a series of sharp, clear hand signals. Ditch DPDs. Ascend to 15 feet. Inflate BCDs. Link up. Conserve energy. It was a radical decision. Abandoning their equipment meant failing the mission, but it was their only chance of survival. Jensen hesitated for a second, the commander's angry voice still echoing in his head. Then he looked at the maelstrom around them, at Corrigan, who was alive only because of Reyes, and he nodded. He cut Wallace's dead scooter loose. Reyes jettisoned her own DPD. The expensive piece of equipment vanished into the blackness without a moment's thought. It was a tool, and its usefulness had ended. They ascended slowly, a tight cluster of 4 divers, and linked arms, forming a human chain. Reyes put herself at the head, facing into the current. She wasn't trying to fight it anymore. That was a fool's errand. She was trying to manage their drift. She pulled out her compass and a small, submersible data slate. The screen's light cast a ghostly green glow on her face. Her fingers moved deftly across the screen, inputting their last known position, the time, and the estimated current speed and direction. She was no longer a diver. She was a human navigation system. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument honed by years of analyzing complex operational data, went to work. She was calculating their drift vector, predicting where the current would take them. There was a small, rocky islet 3 miles to the southeast. It was little more than a pile of wave-battered rocks. But it was land. It was their only hope. She showed the bearing to Jensen. He looked from the compass to her, his eyes asking the question. "Are you sure?" Reyes met his gaze and gave a single, firm nod. There was no doubt in her eyes. There was only certainty. For the first time that night, Jensen felt a flicker of hope. He passed the bearing down the line. Alpha Team, broken and battered, had a new mission. Survive. They kicked slowly, rhythmically, not to fight the current but to angle themselves across it. A long, slow, desperate tack toward a piece of rock they couldn't see, guided only by the calm, unwavering conviction of the woman in the lead. The chaos on the shore was a scene of controlled panic. Flashing lights from emergency vehicles cut strobing patterns through the driving rain. Master Chief Thorne stood near the water's edge, his face grim, coordinating the search and rescue effort with the Coast Guard. Commander Volkov was pacing nearby, shouting into a satellite phone, his voice a mix of fury and desperation. He was trying to manage the fallout, to spin a narrative of unforeseen weather and equipment failure. He was trying to save his career. Bravo Team had surfaced a mile off course. Their DPDs also dead, and had been lucky enough to be picked up by a fishing trawler that heard their emergency beacon. Charlie Team had managed to abort the mission early and make it back to the secondary extraction point, exhausted but safe. Alpha Team was still missing. They were 4 souls swallowed by the storm, and with every passing minute, the hope of finding them alive dwindled. "I have a Coast Guard cutter and 2 helicopters searching the predicted drift pattern, Commander," Thorne reported, his voice flat and professional, betraying none of the rage he felt. "So far, nothing." "They must have had an equipment malfunction," Volkov snapped, gesturing wildly with the phone. "Reyes probably screwed up the navigation." "I knew she was a weak link." Thorne's jaw tightened. "Sir, with all due respect, now is not the time." Just then, a new voice cut through the noise. "Commander Volkov." A man in a crisp, dry uniform was striding toward them, an admiral's star gleaming on his collar. It was Rear Admiral Hayes, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. His face was a thundercloud. "Admiral," Volkov stammered, caught off guard. "We've had an incident." An extreme weather event. Hayes ignored him completely. He walked straight to Thorn. Master Chief, what's the status of my officer? Thorn blinked, confused. Sir? All the candidate officers are accounted for except Ensign Jensen. I'm not talking about Ensign Jensen, Hayes said, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm talking about Lieutenant Commander Reyes. The world seemed to slow down. Volkov froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Thorn stared at the Admiral, trying to process the words. Lieutenant Commander. It was a senior officer rank. A field-grade officer. It was impossible. Sir, Thorn said slowly, there must be some mistake. We have a candidate, Ana Reyes. There's no mistake, Master Chief, Hayes said, his eyes hard as diamonds. He pulled out a tablet and tapped the screen, holding it up. On it was a service record. Reyes, Ana. Rank, Lieutenant Commander. Billet, Special Operations Analyst, OpNav Staff. Her photo, a regulation portrait, showed the same impassive face. But her uniform was adorned with the ribbons of a seasoned and decorated officer. The record detailed a career spent in the shadows. Intelligence analysis for direct action missions, hydrographic threat assessment, operational planning for units whose names were classified. Her last assignment was listed in cryptic terms: internal audit and efficacy assessment, Project Iron Tide. Volkov looked as if he'd been punched. He stared at the screen, then at the raging ocean, then back at the screen. Internal audit? He whispered, the words catching in his throat. She was sent here to validate your selection course from the inside. Commander, Hayes said, his voice dripping with ice. To see if your training methods produced competent operators or just arrogant thugs who follow bad orders. She was evaluating you. And from the looks of this disaster, I'd say her final report is going to be blistering. A radio squawked on the hip of a nearby Coast Guard petty officer. Have a visual. For individuals on the south side of Seal Rock. They're alive. Thorn grabbed the radio. This is Master Chief Thorn. Confirm. You have visual on for survivors. Affirmative. The voice crackled back. They're huddled together. One of them is signaling with a strobe, using coded signals. It's military grade. She's giving us their exact position and status. It's incredibly precise. Thorn looked at the Admiral, whose face was unreadable. They both knew. It was Reyes. While everyone else was scrambling, she had been leading. While they were coordinating a chaotic search, she had been executing a calculated plan for survival. She hadn't waited to be rescued. She had navigated her team to safety and was now directing her own extraction. The ride back to base was silent. The 4 members of Alpha Team sat huddled in thermal blankets in the back of a transport vehicle, the heater blasting. Corrigan was quiet, his earlier panic replaced by a profound, shaken awe. He kept looking at Reyes, who sat staring out the window at the pre-dawn light breaking over the gray landscape. Jensen and Wallace were the same, their gazes repeatedly drawn to the unassuming woman who had saved their lives. The bravado and arrogance had been scoured out of them by the storm, replaced by a raw and humbling respect. When they arrived back at the gear locker, the atmosphere was completely different. The remaining candidates, who had heard the rumors, parted for them as they entered. They looked at Reyes not as a competitor or a target of scorn, but as something else entirely. Something they didn't understand. Commander Volkov was there, standing beside Admiral Hayes and Master Chief Thorn. Volkov's face was pale, his usual confidence shattered. He looked smaller, diminished. As Reyes walked past, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? He had dismissed her, ridiculed her, and sent her into a fatal situation of his own making. She had survived not because of his training, but in spite of it. She had saved 3 of his candidates from his own hubris. Reyes didn't look at him. She walked to her station, dropped her wet gear on the floor with a heavy squelch, and began the methodical process of breaking it down. Her movements were tired but still precise. Admiral Hayes stepped forward. Lieutenant Commander Reyes, he said, his voice formal but with an undercurrent of deep relief. Your mission is complete. Let's get you debriefed. Reyes paused, her hand on the latch of her rebreather. She looked at the Admiral, then around the room at the exhausted, confused faces of the candidates. Finally, her eyes settled on Master Chief Thorne. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. He returned it. It was a shared moment of understanding between two quiet professionals. With respect, Admiral, she said, her voice raspy from salt water and exhaustion. I'm not done. I need to clean my gear. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then a flicker of understanding, of profound respect, dawned in his eyes. She wasn't an auditor anymore. She wasn't a lieutenant commander pulling rank. In that moment, she was one of them, finishing the job to its absolute end. It was the quiet, unglamorous work that defined a true operator. It was an act of integrity that spoke louder than any after-action report she could ever write. Very well, Hayes said, his voice softer now. He turned to Volkov. Commander, my office. Now he walked out, leaving Volkov to follow in his wake like a condemned man. The locker room was silent except for the drip of water and the click and snap of equipment being disassembled. The other candidates watched Reyes for a moment longer. Then, as if released from a spell, they turned and began to tend to their own gear. But the dynamic had permanently shifted. The space around her was different. It was no longer a zone of exclusion, but a pocket of deep, unspoken reverence. Decker, his leg in a cast, was sitting on a bench near the door when she had entered. He had looked down at the floor, unable to meet her eyes, the memory of his "don't cry, baby" taunts now a source of burning shame. Reyes worked methodically, her focus absolute. She laid each component of her rebreather on a clean towel. The scrubber canister, the counterlungs, the breathing hoses, the dive computer. Each piece was rinsed in fresh water, inspected for damage, and carefully dried. It was a ritual, a meditation. It was how you processed the chaos. You brought order to the things you could control. You respected the equipment that had kept you alive. Master Chief Thorne walked over and placed a steaming mug on the bench beside her. Coffee, he said. It was the only word he spoke. Thank you, Master Chief, she replied without looking up. He stood there for a moment watching her work. He had seen hundreds of operators in his 30 years. The loud ones, the quiet ones, the legends, and the washouts. He knew what he was looking at now. He was looking at the standard, the quiet, unshakable center around which everything else revolved. Your analysis of the current, he said, his voice a low rumble. You were right on the money. The data was clear, she said, wiping down a valve. The models were predictable. Thorne almost smiled. She made it sound so simple, as if anyone could have seen it. But they hadn't. They had been blinded by ego, by culture, by the pressure to perform. She had simply seen the truth. Get some rack time when you're done here, Commander, he said, the honorific feeling natural on his tongue for the first time. I will, Master Chief, she said. He nodded once and walked away, leaving her to her work. The first rays of dawn were beginning to filter through the high, salt-stained windows of the gear locker, chasing away the harsh fluorescent glare. The light illuminated the fine scratches and worn patches on her equipment, a testament to a long and arduous career that no one in this room had known existed until a few hours ago. Reyes finished her work. The final component, a small brass valve, was wiped clean and inspected. With a soft, satisfying click, she locked it back into place. The rebreather was whole again, clean and ready. Her task was complete. She stood up, stretched the stiffness from her back, and picked up the mug of coffee. It was still warm. She took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through her chest, and looked out the window at the rising sun painting the sky in shades of gray and pale gold. The storm had passed. The sea was calm.